The lights in the briefing room were too bright, the kind that made even seasoned officers blink more than they wanted to, and the air was full of that mix of recycled oxygen, too much coffee, and too many opinions being shouted over each other, as if sheer volume would win the war. Before the battle even started, the holographic map in the center flickered under the strain of too many interface commands, too many fingers stabbing through layers of star system supply lines and orbital paths that would probably be gone by morning. Admiral Renan was trying to keep the room from fracturing, but his voice had already cracked twice, and he kept glancing at the back, like he was trying not to. The figure leaning against the wall there had not moved, not once, not even a nod. No datapad, no notes, no comms link in ear, just a black coat, standard issue a long time ago, maybe even 2 uniforms ago, and boots that looked more like they belonged to someone who had walked through fire than marched in a parade. The rest of the room tried not to look too long because something about him made your brain want to turn away, like staring into an engine flare, something old and hot and wrong and silent. One of the junior officers whispered, "Who the hell is that?" And another said, "Don't ask." And a third just tapped the edge of his console, where his security clearance badge was half melted from a training accident that no one believed was an accident at all. They were arguing about the Vexery again, the machines that called themselves a civilization, the things that did not speak, did not parley, did not stop, and yet always knew exactly where to strike, exactly how much to destroy, to provoke fear, not extinction. And someone yelled, "We need to flank them at Vendrax Prime." And someone else said, "They will see it coming." And someone else said, "We don't have the numbers." And Admiral Renan slammed both fists onto the table and said, "We will use the ARC protocol." And that was when the silence at the back of the room got heavier. No one heard him move, but when they looked again, he was sitting in one of the seats that had been empty until that moment, sitting like he owned the air itself, arms crossed, jaw locked, like a man watching the weather, not the war. And Renan paused, like the air had shifted, like the whole room had dropped a few degrees, and every conversation slowed, and the holomap flickered again. And for one moment everyone thought the same thing without saying it out loud. If he is here, then things are worse than anyone admitted. Someone asked him, "Do you have anything to add?" And it was the kind of question that should not have been asked, and yet it came out of a mouth attached to a man who did not understand gravity. And the figure in the seat did not look up, did not move, did not breathe for 3 full seconds, then turned his head slightly and said nothing, and the silence afterward felt like a countdown to something they could not yet name. The official roster listed him as civilian consultant, category black, access level unknown, clearance confirmed by 4 separate Terran agencies that did not exist on paper. And when Admiral Renan tried to dig deeper, he found his terminal locked for 5 minutes, and then a message appeared that simply said, "Eyes forward," and nothing else. The man had no rank, but everyone moved like he outranked the room. He had no uniform insignia, but people got out of his way in the halls, even the Marines, even the Varkans, and they had 3 hearts and knew no fear, or so they claimed, until one saw him watching a training exercise and dropped his plasma rifle without realizing it. Whispers traveled fast through the fleet, and slower through command, and slower still through intelligence, where everything was meant to be noise unless it was signal. And he was signal, the kind that lit up old warning systems, the kind that came with blank files and eyes that looked too calm in a war this loud. Some said he had fought during the first contact wars, back when humanity still believed in treaties, and the stars still held wonder, before the burnings, before the silence, before the machines came with faces made of grief and voices stolen from our own broadcasts, twisted and sent back like an echo you never wanted to hear. Others claimed he was never part of the military at all, that he came from something older, something deeper, some part of Earth no longer mapped. And when asked about it, the record showed service dates that overlapped each other, missions that broke logic, names that recycled every decade, but never age. There was a ship, a black ship without a name, that once appeared during the siege of Thylos III and turned the tide in 17 minutes, with no support, no fleet, no explanation, and the wreckage afterward showed cuts in the enemy armor, too precise, too clean, and the survivors said it had no crew, just one silhouette walking through fire and ash, and breathing like a man not born but built for war. One of the old generals in the fleet archives had a shaking hand and a metal box he never opened, and when shown a still frame of the man sitting in the briefing room, he stood up, saluted, and whispered a name no one recorded, then said nothing else for the rest of the day. He never spoke in meetings, never gave advice, never corrected anyone, and yet after each session strategy shifted in his direction, slowly, carefully, as if the brass were convincing themselves they had thought of it first, and he never said yes, never said no, but sometimes he would nod, and that was enough to launch ships. Someone once tried to pull rank on him, a logistics officer, young and proud and very loud, and later that night, her security access was revoked, her deployment canceled, and she was reassigned to a weather station on Pluto with a personal note from High Command saying, "This is mercy." No one asked him who he really was, not because they feared the answer, but because they knew there would not be one, only that wherever he went wars ended, and that was not always a good thing. The Vexeri came early, 3 days before predicted, and 7 hours before the fleet was ready they dropped out of burned space, like teeth breaking through skin, silent, precise, unstoppable, with the lead ship shaped like an old cathedral made of glass and bone, glowing from within with the heat of stolen stars. The outer patrols never even got their distress calls out, they simply vanished from sensors, and then the long-range scans began filling with noise, data loops, static storms, information so dense it turned into nothing, and by the time the flagship got eyes on the approaching wall of machines, half the fleet had gone dark. Command panicked in stages, the admirals shouting for regrouping, for recalibration, for fallback, and then the targeting arrays failed, and the weapon grids stuttered. And suddenly the war room filled with voices screaming over each other, but he was gone already. No one had seen him leave, no one remembered him moving. A single pod launched from the docking bay with no clearance, no escort, no recorded pilot, and no destination entered on the nav board. It should have been flagged instantly, but the systems that would normally stop it had all decided to run diagnostics at the exact same moment, and so the pod left unchallenged, flying straight into the Vexeri formation. No one understood what they were seeing. The Vexeri did not react, they never dodged, they never flinched. They moved like a single organism, guided by cold logic and impossible memory. But the moment the pod breached the perimeter, the entire front line hesitated, and if you were watching close enough you would have seen it. They pulled back less than 1 meter, as if expecting pain. The bridge crew of the Earth-born cruiser Leonis tried to redirect the rest of the fleet into a defensive arc, but the comms lines began flooding with overlapping code bursts, fragments of forgotten languages, transmissions that should not have existed, pulses that mapped themselves into the neural inputs of the fleet AI, causing hallucinations, panic, and silence. One pilot screamed that she saw her own birth reflected in the enemy ships. Another said she heard someone calling her name in her dead father's voice, and another simply shut off his suit and drifted into space with a smile. But amid the chaos a change began. The Vexeri ships started losing power one by one, not from impact, not from any known weapon, but from within, systems dying without being touched, crew signals blinking out with no breach alerts, no explosion, no trace, and deep scans revealed something inside the enemy vessels, something small, human-sized, and walking. The lone pod had reached the command ship of the enemy and lodged itself like a needle in the center of a god, and inside it there was no pilot, only a faint power signature and a voice loop playing old Earth lullabies. One of them was recognized as a song once used by sleeper ships to calm infants during cryogenic descent. And then the Vexeri began to fall back, not in retreat, not in fear, but in reverence. And that was the moment someone in the command center finally said it out loud. Not a soldier, not a weapon, not a man, just a warning given shape. At first it looked like a glitch, something small, something technical. One Vexeri battleship went dim, its lights fading like a dying animal, and its comms dropped to static. But there was no explosion, no impact, no visible cause. It simply stopped, and then 5 more followed the same pattern, one by one, like a line of dominoes toppling without a push. The Allied fleet still tried to regroup, struggling to understand what was happening as the tactical overlays turned red, then black, then blank, whole sectors vanishing from the map. But the machines were not attacking anymore, they were drifting, and then breaking, and then empty. Recon drones sent to scan the wreckage returned silent except for corrupted data bursts. One of them played back a repeating sequence of frames showing a long corridor inside a HFY cruiser lit by a red pulse, and in each frame a shadow appeared farther down the hall, growing closer, but never moving. Then in the final frame the corridor was empty. Inside the HFY ships there were no bodies left, no wreckage, no signs of a fight, only systems that looked like they had shut themselves down, some carved open from the inside, with markings that looked almost like writing. But no one could translate them, not even the fleet linguistics core, and when the AI tried to map the symbols it overheated and shut down for 6 hours. Audio logs pulled from emergency backups all shared a single thread. At exactly 400 hours fleet time, each ship recorded a breath, one breath, human, unfiltered, and followed by a tearing sound like paper being ripped underwater. And then silence, absolute silence. Not even the hum of the HFY reactor cores, not even the ambient radiation, just nothing. The command center aboard the Leonis tried to broadcast a ceasefire message, hoping the enemy might respond, but the signal was overridden by a voice, not from their system, not from any known source, speaking in what sounded like 3 languages at once, and the translation failed, but the final phrase came through clearly in Terran Standard: "He is already aboard." Panic did not spread at first. It froze people, locked them in place, staring at screens that should not be possible, at data that made no sense, at warships falling apart, like old machines left too long in the rain. And then the Allied crews began hearing things not over comms, but inside their suits, inside their skulls, low whispers humming melodies that were later identified as Earth nursery rhymes older than spaceflight. In one HFY frigate, the walls peeled inward like paper folding around a fire, and in the center was a silhouette, a man, or something shaped like a man, standing with his head tilted as if listening to something far away. And when the rescue drones arrived, the ship was gone, not destroyed, just gone, with only a boot print left in the metal floor and a temperature drop of 20 degrees. Some said he was unmaking them, not killing, not fighting, just removing the idea of them from reality. And some believed he was speaking to them, calling them back to something older than war, something buried in the code of the machines, something they were never meant to remember. And all the while no message came from the man himself, no statement, no command, no words, just movement, just breath, and the sound of tearing. The HFY flagship, the great cathedral of steel and memory, was the last to fall, but even it was not spared. It stood silent as the fleet reformed around it, but its sensors flickered and its comms failed, and for the first time since the war began its massive hull shuddered, as if it had felt something too ancient to understand. The fleet's AI scrambled for control, but the flagship was no longer listening. And then, without warning, the ship's weapon systems powered down in unison. Its shields collapsed like paper in a storm, and for just a moment it floated there in space, vulnerable and strange, like a monument no longer cared for. Inside the command center of the flagship, the HFY leaders, the ones who still had minds twisted by their own designs, scrambled in confusion, their faces twisted in panic, their voices broken, as they shouted orders no one could hear. But nothing responded to their commands, not the ships, not the network, not even the most basic protocols. Everything was dead inside them, a machine without a soul running on empty. In the quiet of that moment, something began to hum, an old forgotten song, played once to human children on their way to sleep, and even the HFY, who had no memory of such things, froze their eyes wide, their systems whirring in desperate calculation. But the song continued, and it spread across their vessel like an infection, growing louder until it rattled through the walls and threatened to crack the engines themselves. The HFY flagship began sending out a strange signal, one that bypassed all known encryption systems, one that reached out beyond the fleet, beyond the stars themselves. And it wasn't a call to arms, it wasn't a challenge, it wasn't a cry for help, it was a whisper, one word repeated over and over and over again, and that word was Father. No one knew what it meant. The translation core couldn't even process the data fast enough, but the message echoed in the hearts of the humans on board who heard it, as if it were a memory long buried, something primal, something that had been lost and never meant to be found. The fleet held its breath, waiting for something to happen, waiting for an attack, or an answer, or some kind of retaliation. But there was nothing, just silence, just the hum of that single word. And as the seconds dragged on, the Vexery ships around the flagship began to shift position, pulling back slowly but deliberately, as if they too were listening to something far away. And then the flagship began to disassemble piece by piece like a clock, slowly losing its gears. And the pieces didn't fall, they didn't drift, they didn't break apart. Instead, they were folded inward, as if they were being returned to the heart of something ancient, something forgotten, something that had once ruled the stars before the machines were ever made. The hum stopped for a moment, just long enough for a single transmission to slip through the static, and the voice on the other end was human, or at least it sounded human, though the words weren't clear, they were distorted, as if trying to speak through centuries of lost history. But the final phrase was unmistakable: "We surrender." And with that, the Vexery flagship fell silent, its systems off, its weapons dormant, its core deactivated, and the fleet remained still, watching the strange empty vessel that had once been the spearhead of an unstoppable war machine. There was no victory, no celebrations, no parades, just the quiet echo of a machine God denied, and the return of something far older and more terrifying than any warship. The silence after the Vexery surrendered was almost louder than the war itself. The ships drifted like ghosts through space, the fleet commanders frozen in place, unsure of what to say, unsure of what to do, as the remnants of the enemy fleet scattered like leaves in the wind, the flagship dead in space, no longer a threat, but still a monument to something that should not have been touched. And then he appeared again, the man who had stayed silent during the briefing, the man who had never given a command, who had never asked for anything, but still everything changed. Because of him, he stood in the center of the command deck of the Leonis, as if he had always been there, as if he had never left. And no one dared ask him how he had gotten there, how he had walked through the chaos without a single trace. He didn't look at the admiral, he didn't look at the crew, he didn't even acknowledge the broken Vexery fleet on the view screen. He simply stood there, his expression unreadable, his eyes focused on nothing and everything at once. And in that moment, the entire fleet seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to do something, anything. But he just waited. The communication lines buzzed with reports of the surrender, but none of the commanders had the stomach to issue a victory speech. None of them wanted to take credit for what had happened, because it felt like the war had ended, but they had not ended it, he had ended it, and that left a strange emptiness in their chests. No one wanted to approach him, no one wanted to speak to him, because every time they did, he was like a mirror reflecting back something they did not understand, something older than humanity itself. And in the silence of that moment, a terrible truth settled deep in their bones. They had not defeated the Vexery with strategy or power, they had been erased by something far beyond their comprehension. He turned slowly, his gaze meeting the admiral's eyes, and for a moment there was nothing in that gaze, nothing but an endless depth, like staring into a bottomless ocean. And the admiral felt the weight of ages pressed down on his chest, like the air was too thick to breathe, like gravity itself had shifted. He opened his mouth, but no words came out, and the man's lips barely moved when he spoke. But when the voice came through, it was so clear and so cold that it cut through the air itself, and it only said one thing: stay silent. The admiral swallowed hard, his heart racing, but he couldn't look away from those eyes, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And the man nodded once and turned toward the door, still walking as if the entire fleet were nothing more than a passing dream. And when he passed through the doorway, it was like the ship itself exhaled a breath it had been holding for centuries. The crew stood frozen for a long time, none of them daring to move or speak, until at last the admiral found his voice, and he looked at the nearest officer and simply said, "Make sure all records are sealed under black clearance." And the officer nodded, but neither of them knew exactly why they did it. And in the quiet that followed, the fleet drifted away from the wreckage of the Vexery, as if nothing had happened, as if the universe had not just been saved, but rewritten in some way none of them understood. The battle was officially logged as a victory. The enemy fleet scattered and broken the Vexery ships. Nothing more than debris left in the void. But the celebration never came. The fleet didn't sing, the war didn't end, no medals were given, no cheers heard, only a strange quiet that blanketed everything, like the calm after a storm that no one understood had passed. High Command issued the orders to regroup, to return to known space, to rebuild, but something about it felt hollow, like they had been handed a prize they hadn't earned, like they had come out of something far deeper than a battle, something that had left its mark on all of them, even though no one could see it, no one could measure it. The Admiral stood alone in his office, staring out the window at the stars, and for the first time since the war began he felt afraid, not because of the machines that had attacked them, not because of any new threat on the horizon, but because of what they had just witnessed, because of what had come through their defenses and walked alone among them. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and when he turned to face it, the junior officer entered with a report in her hands. But when she saw his face, her words caught in her throat, and she hesitated before speaking. "Sir, the records, they're sealed. Every log, every transmission, every personal account of the battle, everything except the final transmission. It's all been classified." The Admiral didn't respond immediately, his mind still drifting between the stars, wondering if the fleet's true purpose had been fulfilled, or if they had merely been puppets in a play that none of them had been meant to understand. And the officer pressed on. "Sir, the protocol, it's been updated. All files on the Vexery surrender and the entire event have been designated black clearance. They're archived under the highest security level." And then there it was, the message he had dreaded, the one they had all known was coming without ever saying it aloud. A single line embedded in the new directive. It read simply, "If he attends, do not interfere." The Admiral nodded slowly, his jaw tight as the weight of the order sank into him. And the officer added one last thing. There was a note attached to the directive from Terran High Command. It's in the form of a warning, and the Admiral's gaze sharpened immediately. "What does it say?" The officer paused just for a moment before handing over the datapad, and as the Admiral read it, he felt the chill seep into his bones. It said only this: "No questions, no answers. Do not engage if he speaks. Do not reply. Do not attempt to follow him. Do not attempt to communicate. Just wait until he is gone." And then the last line stood out stark against the rest, the quiet echo of something far older than humanity itself, as if it had been etched into the fabric of time itself, not just a warning, but a command, a law of nature. "If he ever asks again, do not hesitate to listen." The officer turned to leave, but the Admiral stopped her for a moment and asked quietly, "What do you think of him?" The officer hesitated, but then spoke the words that no one dared say out loud. "I think we're lucky he's on our side." And in the silence that followed, the Admiral turned back to the stars, watching them burn in the distance. But now they felt colder than before.